She left the gate at 6 in the morning with a plastic bag and a single purpose: milk. The gate closed behind her with the small, ordinary sound of a morning that had nothing to hide. Helena Medeiros moved through the dawn like someone practicing anonymity. Plain jeans, a faded jacket, no badge, no uniform, no way for the world to recognize the woman who had spent a decade commanding men in blue. For Helena, 5 minutes at the corner market was a tiny theft of peace. It was the one thing she allowed herself, domestic, unremarkable, because the rest of her life required first names and ranks and the constant recalibration of authority. Being Captain Medeiros meant never slipping. It meant always being watched, in uniform or out. That morning, she wanted to forget the obligation and feel briefly what the rest of the neighborhood felt: invisible and free. Visibility, she had learned, could be weapon or shield. She had taught recruits that every badge was both promise and responsibility. She had also learned that some men in uniform treated that promise like an entitlement. She had not expected their entitlement to find her leaving her own home. They stepped out of the shadows like a rehearsed insult. The patrol car was black paint, dented on the passenger door, a stale cigarette burn on the vinyl. 3 men spilled from it: Sargento Valdir, who carried the smell of cheap rum the way others wore cologne; Soldier Ricardo, a young man flushed with arrogance like it had been his uniform's second patch; and Soldier Alves, whose face was roughed by doubt and the kind of fatigue that comes from a long grip on small power. They cut her off at the corner with the practiced bluntness of predators who believe the world still bends to their instinct. Valdir's greeting was a leer, a map of menace that required no words. Ricardo spoke fast, careless. "What are you doing out at this hour? Where are you headed, lady?" They were the kind of men who had learned to make small, invasive questions count as control. Helena responded, like she always did in public, measured, polite, a voice that gave nothing away. She smiled once, an automatic mask, and said she was getting milk. The answer should have been enough to end the encounter. It was not. "You living around here?" Valdir asked. He stepped closer. The morning air seemed to tighten, the way a room does when laughter dies and attention sharpens. Helena noticed the way Ricardo's hand drifted near his holster, the way Alves watched her chest instead of her eyes. She catalogued details the way she had been trained to: broken watch on Ricardo's wrist, a thin line of scar at Valdir's eyebrow, the chipped tip of Alves's boot. They searched her. The search was half performance, half humiliation. Valdir thrust questions between the folds of routine and depravity. He joked about a bribe. Ricardo made a crude suggestion that she could pay with more than money. Alves kept glancing toward the patrol car, as if he feared being watched. When Valdir shoved her, it was with the casual force of a man testing limits. He didn't need to hurt her to make his point. Humiliation would suffice. Their laughter was a small colony of predators who had learned somewhere along the line that uniforms could absolve them. They escorted her to the back of their station like a punishment more meaningful for its symbolism than its brutality. A transfer of ownership, a reminder that in that moment she was no longer the captain who issued orders, but a woman who could be put in a room and forgotten. The depot smelled like oil and bleach, a smell that stuck to clothes and memory. The light was a single bulb that hummed like an indifferent witness. It threw shadows across her hands as she held the milk bottle to her chest. They locked the door. There is a kind of violence in being made invisible by people who should know better. They took her name like it was a tally mark. They stripped her of context. They gave her another label, a thing to be poked at, negotiated with, discarded. For 3 hours they practiced small cruelties. A crude joke, a shove that left no mark, a demand for money phrased like a favor, an insistence she make some admission, anything that would let them reduce her to a stereotype. At first, Helena felt the hot rush of disbelief. It is a particular shock to be treated as less than what you are when you can see plainly every possible route back to authority. But disbelief is not a plan. Her training, practical, clinical, acquired in briefing rooms lit by fluorescent light, did something else. It steadied her. She chose to remember. If she could not control the moment, she would control its evidentiary edge. Remembering in detail is a tactical decision. Names, voices, the cadence of laughter, their shoes scuffing the concrete, how Valdir's breath smelled like mint and rust. The way Ricardo called Valdir boss in a tone that implied that each favor extracted was a deposit into an account both illicit and expected. Helena's mind worked like a notepad. She catalogued every slur and soft touch, every angle of light, every creak of the door. Every humiliation was a line she crossed into a ledger. They underestimated her in the way predators always do. They mistook compliance for surrender. She did not fight them physically. She did not yell. She did not beg. She was calm because panic would scatter evidence. Calm conserved energy for the work that really mattered. Observation. Between their jokes, the men argued, it was always the same petty mixture of bravado and fear. "She looks like she could be someone," Ricardo said once, voice dropping with a hint of worry. "Maybe she's just some woman." "Maybe," Valdir said, and spat the word like a verdict. They left the depot twice. Each exit was a small relief, a false promise. They came back with fresh cigarettes or a bottle, as if the world outside could be taxed to keep the joke interesting. They would leave the door cracked sometimes, their laughter trailing off into the street. Each return taught her another detail, a motorcycle passing that always arrived at the same hour, the specific squeak of the gate outside. Time did not pass in hours, so much as in the small, repeatable things that measure a beating heart and the slow cooling of a room. Helena did what she could to remain invisible to them and invisible to the instinct to retaliate. Violence would have erased the one thing they could not rewrite, the record of their faces and voices. She kept her phone hidden, an inert rectangle beneath her sleeve. She had the presence of mind to keep certain movements minimal, clenched fists, quick breaths, and to let the men believe they had broken her. She wasn't broken. Hours stretched. Shadows shifted on the concrete floor. Her hands stopped trembling. Her mind rehearsed legal sequences, how to document, how to preserve, how to transmit. She ran through procedures aloud in her head. Corregidoria's chain, contact points at the Ministerio Público, the request number for internal video evidence, until the words themselves became a map out of the depot. You could have hit them, she thought once. It was a private reasoning, a short flash, a different kind of justice in the moment. The thought passed like lightning. She was not a reckless person. She had been taught that single necessary truth of institutional life. Impulse kills cases. Method wins them. So, she watched. At some point, one of them, Alves, paused at the doorway and let a slant of light fall across the floor. He looked at her for a beat longer than propriety allowed. There was a human look then, a flicker of something like guilt, or perhaps the recognition that what they were doing would leave a stain they would carry. He was not like the others. That flicker sealed him in her account as both witness and potential ally. When they finally left the depot door ajar and the hum of the station seemed to sag into a quiet that was almost respectful, Helena moved with the economy of practiced hands. She had not touched the milk bottle until that moment. The plastic had become both prop and talisman. She set it down and let her fingers explore the phone concealed at her side. Tiny hands. Light. She typed in notes with the kind of speed she had learned to use after long hours writing reports. Times, snippets of phrases, the cadence of Valdir's threats. She recorded a short audio file, a sentence, a name, then stopped, aware of legal and ethical lines. Recorded evidence could be invaluable. It could also be challenged. Chain of custody mattered. She noticed the security camera peripherally, a box mounted high, coated in a film of grime that suggested never being tested, the lens pointing south toward the depot door. It was old equipment. It breathed a weak static that matched the hum of the light. Someone had installed it and then chosen quietly and deliberately to ignore it. It was an institutional blind spot. A camera that people thought worthless will be the kind of miracle you can plan for. Helena understood the principle. People who assume their small crimes are invisible often leave the instruments of their undoing corroded, dusty, and therefore carefully predictable. She could not access the footage from the depot with the men standing only meters away, but she could file the memory. Cameras did not lie, they only recorded. If she could prove that a mounted lens existed and had recorded, she could force the institution to listen. By then, their confidence had settled into the room like cigarette smoke. They thought the minimal humiliation, the remarks, the joke, would disappear into the morning. It would not be so simple. Her watch read close to 3 hours when the shift's rhythm shifted unexpectedly. A radio call echoed faintly down the hall, then another, then the distinctive sharp tone of a phone being pressed against a chest. The conversation was incomprehensible at first, just compressed phrases and clipped protocol, then more voices, one with the cadence of an officer used to being obeyed. Helena recognized it. Guzmau's voice, the major who was nominally the second in command at the battalion. The men's faces changed. Something in the air tightened the way frost tightens a leaf. Valdir straightened in a way that said he finally understood the limits of his small authority. There was a sound, near simultaneous. Footsteps, the flap of a jacket, the foreign noise of a higher rank entering a room that had been permitted to forget the chain of command. Guzmau's arrival was a kind of arithmetic. He carried with him the possibility of rescue, but rescue in institutional language often meant different things. For some, it meant accountability. For others, it meant containment. "Where did she go?" Guzmau asked when he saw the open depot door and the milk on the floor. His voice had a texture that suggested both alarm and an instinct to close ranks. Valdir and Ricardo stammered around explanations, words clumsy and defensive. Alves's fingers fumbled with a cigarette butt and avoided Guzmau's eyes. Helena let Guzmau approach. She did not stand. She let her hands be visible, nothing in them but the empty bottle, a symbol that was quickly legible. She let the major's gaze sweep over her coat, her shoes, the small, methodical record she had been building for 3 hours. Guzmau hesitated for a fraction before addressing her. "Who are you?" It was a ridiculous question, one of those absurdities the uniform create to exercise authority. Helena smiled, not full and not warm. It was a professional expression meant to convey control. "You know my name," she said. "Captain Medeiros. I'm with the city force." For a moment the room held its breath. The men who had just treated her as less than woman and less than a captain became small in that instant. The major's jaw tightened. The hierarchy reasserted itself through the simplest variable, rank. Within minutes, the pattern of institutional response, imperfect, bureaucratic, but inexorable, began to rearrange the room. Guzmau took a step back toward his radio. He called into the line, clipped and businesslike. Someone on the other end of the chain asked for confirmation. There was a name exchanged, then the promise of a voice that would loom higher. Colonel Nunez. Helena watched the major's face while he spoke. She studied the way he arranged words to save face and calculate risk. She understood the calculus of the moment. For some officers, calling higher meant offering a shield to wrongdoers. For others, calling higher meant staging the correction. Guzmau's call would reveal which side he intended to be on. The room became a field of potential witnesses and recalibrated men. Ulves, who had looked uncertain before, looked suddenly like a man about to choose. The choice, in that little square of concrete, felt heavy. There was a shift in the rhythm of the battalion. Radios that had been murmuring returned to taut channels. The name Medeiros moved through the station like a current. Command mobilized, at least enough to admit a mistake had been made. The arrival of higher-ups would change the dynamic. It would not guarantee truth. It would offer a forum. Helena let them move around her, as if she were private property being sorted. She let the major, who was visibly checking the station's security logs, see her watch and the times she had stood in the depot. She let him see how steady she was. She let him see, subtly, that while his men had drunk their way into arrogance, she had recorded her way into evidence. Within an hour, a junior technician, Andrade, a corporal with the station whose loyalty had always leaned more toward integrity than expediency, entered carrying a small, outdated control box for the cameras. Andrade had been trained under her last year. She recognized the way his eyes moved when he understood a problem. He wore the guarded expression of someone who had watched the wrong thing happen enough times to know which side to keep his hands on. "If there's footage," Andrade said quietly, "we can pull it. There's a camera that points right at the depot. It hasn't been checked in months, but, Guzmão prompted. "It might still be there," Andrade said. "The system records to tape. If the tape is there, we can copy it. There's procedure, chain of custody stuff, but we can secure it." Helena felt something like a small, controlled hunger. Evidence becomes an action. She stood, finally, feet touching the concrete like the rest of the room. "Do it," she said. "Secure whatever there is. Lock it, seal it. I want a copy." Her voice carried the economy of someone who had been shouting for accountability in briefing rooms and getting polite nods in return. Now, the demand had the advantage of being an immediate, corporeal thing. A camera tape, a chain of custody, physical evidence. It was a pivot from the theater of personal humiliation to the machinery of justice. They moved with bureaucratic efficiency that was messy and human. Andrade and a technician went to access the control room, tripping over cables and arguing with a console that coughed out faded timestamps. A grunt of radio static. The station's logbook opened like a relic. Guzmão's fingers flipped through pages that smelled of grease and paper, and he penciled the time in his handwriting. Helena felt her chest tighten at the small rituals of custody. Plastic evidence bags, signatures at specific boxes, fingerprints minimized by gloves. Chain of custody can crush a case that should be simple. She knew that better than most. The evidence needed to be treated like a crown, handled correctly, preserved and presented. Any misstep, and the men who had humiliated her might slip back into myth. They found footage. The system had done its job in a mechanical, indifferent way. The camera had recorded a grainy sweep of the depot area. In frames that looked unremarkable at first glance, 3 men came and went. A shadow bent, a hand reached, a shoved shoulder pressed a person against concrete. Faces were grainy, but present. Valdir's distinctive scar. Ricardo's chipped watch glinting in one frame. Alves, a profile that matched the gap in his tooth. And there it was, time-stamped, poor quality, but unalterable. A camera that had been ignored by those who thought themselves untouchable had kept a ledger of the morning's insults. Andrade handled the copying with the kind of attentiveness that comes from someone who remembers seeing cases collapse because a prosecutor was sloppy. He wiped the reader, then connected a small flash drive. "We need to document everything," he said. "I'll log the transfer, sign it. You should be present." Helena leaned over the console. The image filled the small screen, a world reduced to pixels, motion slowed for clarity. She watched herself on that screen, a figure that was both intimate and flattened by technology. It hurt to see the way they had moved around her, but more than pain, there was recognition. This was now material. "You need to be careful with this," Andrade said. "Anyone can say the drive was doctored later. We can't control everything, but we can control the chain from here." Helena nodded, Her hands were steady as Andrade slid the copied file into a sealed evidence bag and verified the checksum, the digital fingerprint that would wrench the opportunity from anyone who tried to alter the file later. It was a clean, bureaucratic brutality, a sequence of details that turned assault into something the institution had to answer for. As they worked, she felt the first quiet, resolute flicker of strategy bloom. It would not happen by charm. It would happen by exposing the truth with such clarity that even the complacent would be forced to act. She thought of courtrooms and cameras and the way public pressure had a peculiar habit of making people answer to uncomfortable facts. But bureaucracy can be both ally and obstacle. For every officer moved by the footage, there would be others who would close the ranks. For every official who demanded explanation, there would be an equal and opposite force that wanted to contain the scandal. Helena knew the battalion's politics well enough to predict both. She had learned early that justice is less often the natural endpoint of truth than the contested product of persistence and procedure. When the copied file sat sealed in an evidence envelope and Andrade had initialed the chain of custody log, Helena felt the situation pivot. She stepped back into the light of the depot, the sound of the station's radio, a static chorus in the corridor. Outside, the morning had brightened. Cars moved along the street as if the day did not know how close it had come to cracking open. Someone in the doorway said the word "Colonel," as if pronouncing a verdict. There were calls being made now that would travel further than the station, to the Colonel Nunez office, to the Corregidoria, perhaps even, if the momentum carried, toward public channels that could not be easily contained. Helena's phone buzzed with a message she hadn't noticed before, a brief, obligatory text from the Home Security Service confirming that the gate had been opened at precisely 5:58 a.m. It was a small, almost comic detail, but to her it read like testimony. The world had been watching in its small ways. Technology, which had once allowed the three men to assume authority without scrutiny, now offered her the means to prove their abuse. Alone for a second, she closed her eyes and let the weight of 3 hours settle into her knees. The humiliation had not ended with the tape. It would not be erased by any procedure. There were scars of the sort that did not show up on camera. The altered way she would look at herself in mirrors, the private replaying of mockery, the quiet knowledge that men who wore the same uniform as her had taken advantage in the shelter of their numbers. But the ledger existed now. The tape was a turning point. It was the hinge upon which accountability might swing. Guzmao's voice interrupted her reverie. "We're going to need a formal report," he said. His tone had cooled to something professional and careful. "I'll call the colonel. I'll notify Corregidoria. For now, we secure all evidence and take statements. We'll follow the protocol. Protocol is the music of institutions. It can save or smother. Helena had spent enough time inside its notes to know that sounding the right rhythm could summon either reform or revenge. She owed herself to the method. She owed herself to the work. She signed the log Andrade handed her with a thing like mechanical calm. Her signature, neat and legible, felt like a public artifact of a private violation. As Guzmao left the depot to make the required calls, Valdir and Ricardo exchanged glances that had a narrowed sharpness about them. It was the look of men discovering that a small daring might ripple into consequences none of them wanted. Alves stood apart, watching the exchange, as if the choice faced in that hallway was larger than any single man. Helena stepped out of the depot into the station's thin light and tasted metal in the air, the smell of the coffee from the mess, the faint chemical bite of disinfectant, and beneath it, the rawness of the morning. Her phone pulsed again. A call from an unknown number. She ignored it, preferring to let the chain of command move first. There was a careful choreography to how information moved in police work. Throwing it into the public sphere too fast could be used against her by men who understood the power of narrative. And yet she also knew the press would act like a river. Once a current started, it would find a bed. If the institution stalled, the story would seep into tabloids hungry for spectacle and politicians eager to divert. She thought of Marcelo Varela, a journalist known for sharp teeth and sharper angles, and pictured him circling like a vulture toward anything that could be dressed as scandal. The thought did not deter her. It sharpened the seat of her planning. The first calls to Colonel and Corregidora were procedural. Guzmão's voice was muted now, fading down the corridor. The protocol would bring auditors and inquiries, the hesitant steps of an institution forced to look inward. Helena felt the machinery of accountability engage like slow gears. But for every gear that engaged, there would be another cog ready to stall it. Political pressure, media manipulation, the soft interventions of power. She had seen shields lowered in exchange for promises whispered in offices that smelled of old leather and ambition. She had a plan because she was made of plans. Plans are not the same as righteousness. They are the instruments you use when righteousness is not enough. They are cold and necessary. And so, with the tape secured and the chain of custody begun, she began to sketch the next steps in her head in a few terse notations. Keep the evidence sealed, secure witness statements, ensure that Alves's testimony is recorded soon, monitor for leaks, prepare a public statement that presses the battalion to act, draft a letter to the Corregidora with a copy to the Ministerio Público, detailing the events and the request for immediate investigation. In the quiet of the depot corridor, she allowed herself a small, private satisfaction. It was not the flush of triumph she might have expected. It felt sharper and stranger, a cold precision, like placing a delicate, lethal piece on a map and knowing the rest of the pieces would have to move in response. The morning had flexed its muscles and revealed a fracture. She had turned the fracture into an instrument. Her victory at that moment was procedural and therefore fragile. It would need reinforcement by testimony, corroboration, and time. It would need the difficult work of keeping the narrative clean while the men with motives to obscure and the politicians with motives to spin began their own maneuvers. She thought of the smell of the depot and the hum of the camera, and imagined the footage running on a loop in the minds of people who would not want to be seen doing what they had done. She thought of the milk bottle, now cold and sweating on the floor, an absurd relic of ordinary life. It had come to mean something else. The place where a normalized cruelty had unfolded. When Guzmão re-entered and announced he had spoken to the colonel, the station shifted again. There were orders to catalogue, to protect the evidence, to limit who could speak. Guzmão's eyes flicked to Valdir and Ricardo with a mixture of reproach and calculation. He patted Andrade on the shoulder and said, "Make sure everything is logged. Full report by tonight." Helena nodded. She watched each motion, each bureaucratic smallness, as if nursing a wound and plotting the sutures. The tape had given her a new body to the morning's insult. It had made the humiliation public in the only way institutions count, through transmissible evidence. There would be fallout. There would be attempts to smear, to rewrite, to pretend the men had acted within routine. There would be talk of a misunderstanding and invitations to mediate. There would be pressures subtle and blunt. She had seen those forces before, when a case exposed a higher sin. Quiet calls from politicians, the rerouting of investigations into softer channels, the occasional leak that turned principle into gossip. Helena understood how reputations can become currency, and how currency often buys silence. She knew that the moment she allowed the narrative to be shaped by the wrong mouths, the men who had humiliated her could become the ones who controlled the story. So she moved before the story could harden into rumor. Before she trusted any single channel, she documented, sealed, and prepared to disseminate in a way that outpaced the usual protective strategies. She had learned that timing can be a weapon. Used well, it can convert a small indignity into an institutional reckoning. As the day unfolded, she began to organize the evidence into the architecture of an accusation. The grainy camera footage would be the spine. Alves's shaky presence was the muscle. Andrade's careful copies were the skin that protected the structure from attack. Guzmao's initial calls placed the case inside the formal machine. She began to work on the public scaffolding as well, a short, precise statement that framed the incident as institutional failure rather than a personal act of vengeance, and a demand that would be hard to absorb into platitudes. Immediate investigation, protected witness statements, temporary suspension of those implicated pending inquiry. When she finally left the depot, feet on the street, the sun now higher and untroubled, the world looked like any other day. People went about their errands. The corner shop sold cigarettes and bread. Yet for her, the ordinary world had altered. The morning's violence had been translated into something else. A case file, a sealed drive, a log with her neat signature. She carried the milk bottle like a relic. It meant nothing to anyone who did not know the labor of that morning, and everything to her. By the time she reached her gate again, her phone buzzed with another call. She answered. "Colonel Nunes speaking," said the voice on the other end, brief, controlled. There was the faint impression of an office, a cup placed down, the scrape of a boot. His words were careful. He had been briefed. He asked questions that were both institutional and personal. Where had she been stopped? Who were the officers involved? Were there witnesses? Helena gave him what she could in that first call, and kept the tape and the chain of custody as the central truth. She sensed, even in the measured cadences of Colonel Nunes's responses, the beginning of a theater, a careful orchestration to defend the institution while allowing for the appearance of action. She had seen such theater before. She planned to make sure the theater did not swallow the facts. When she hung up, the weight of the day settled again. She thought of the months and years ahead, investigations, hearings, a political current that might try to swallow the truth. She thought of the power of public exposure and its twin, public revenge. There are ways to use visibility that are righteous. There are ways that make scapegoats of victims. She had to navigate that seam with the precision of a surgeon. For now, though, she had bought a different currency, attention. The camera had given her attention. The task was now to spend it wisely. Inside her home, the milk bottle went on the small kitchen counter as if nothing had happened. She left the jacket on a chair, the kind that holds evidence like a patient waiting for the doctor's careful hands. She undressed with the clinical, slow movements of someone preserving a case. The clothes folded, the phone placed on the counter, the evidence bag sealed and stored under lock by Andrade's insistence. She felt exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness that follows the center of indignity, the fatigue of having had to be more than she wanted to be. Helena looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. For a fraction, she allowed herself a private, furious recognition. She had been reduced by men who should have been protectors, and she had used the institution's own mechanics to make them visible. There would be political interference. There would be the predictable vultures who saw scandal as opportunity. There would be Marcelo Varela's nose for a headline and Deputy Bastos's interest in controlling the narrative. She pictured them. Varela with his tabloid's glint, Bastos with his crisp suit and quieter ambition. They were the layers that sat above the immediate officers, men and men of power who would have interests beyond truth. But tonight she would not wrestle the whole system. There would be time for that. For now, she ran a finger across the sealed evidence bag, across the edge of the milk bottle, and finally sank into a chair too small for how large the day had felt. She had won the first factual skirmish. The camera had recorded what had played out in that depot. The men who had humiliated her had been exposed to the possibility of accountability. What she could not foresee were all the ways that visibility can be redirected. She could not yet see the waves of rumor and the targeted smear that often follow an exposed wrongdoing. She knew from the arsenals of institutional politics how reputations can be weaponized. She was not naive enough to think a single tape would end corruption. She was not optimistic enough to believe the system would correct itself without pressure. Still, there was a small, clean truth in the kitchen light. Someone had recorded the morning. Someone had noticed. Evidence existed now as a thing that could not be simply shrugged away. Helena closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in the smell of the room. Coffee cooling, detergent, a faint metallic whisper in the air. When she opened them, she already had schematics running behind her eyes. A letter to Corregidoria, a directed call to a trusted media contact who would not sensationalize, but would ensure the case could no longer be buried, a protected channel for Alves to give a recorded statement away from the men who might intimidate him. She would build the trap of truth carefully. She would not raise a sword. She would present a dossier that the battalion could not ignore without losing credibility. She would use the ugly levers of publicity not for gossip, but to force procedure to act. The phone buzzed again. A text from Andrade, confirming he had logged everything. A sanitized message from Guzmão that the colonel had been notified and would be at the station within the hour. There was a name at the bottom of Andrade's message. A journalist, one Helena had never trusted completely, Marcelo Varela. The text said simply, "He asked for comment. He's asking for an exclusive." She set the phone down with the same care she had given each small piece of evidence. There would be choices about how and when to let the story out, and to whom. She would not give Varela a single unguarded moment. He would package the morning into a spectacle, into clickbait, into fodder for judges who did not favor women, who accused those in power. Still, Varela was a lever, sometimes blunt but effective. There would be times when blunt force is a tool. She would use him if she could control the frame. She would bait, yes, but not in the crudity of revenge. She would bait for exposure. The rest would have to be sterling procedure. That night, when the lamps went low and her home returned to the blunted silence that had been kept at bay by the morning's alarms, she sat with the sealed drive in front of her and thought of the 3 hours like a geography she had traversed. There were cliffs, the initial stop, the shove, the depot. There were plains, the long, steady hours of recorded calculation. There were rivers that ran through the map, evidence, chain of custody, witness. She would cross each in turn. The first crossing, getting the tape and the signatures in place, was done. But she also knew this. The true reckoning would not be the immediate arrests or the tense words in a hallway. Its brutality would be the slow, public exposure, the way reputations would be stripped, the way men who depended on courtesy and silence would find themselves subject to testimony and to the unforgiving clarity of recorded footage. She held on to that thought like a promise that was also a task. There would be a cost. There would be threats. There would be attempts to sabotage her work and to smear her name. There would be, perhaps, loneliness. But there was also the sense of a line drawn. 3 hours of humiliation had been answered not by vengeance in the dark, but by a plan that took their own tools and applied them against them. If this is gripping you, stay with the rest of the story. There's a single decision she makes next that changes everything. She had expected the first answers to arrive like a slow tide. What surprised her was how quickly the station filled with people who could not be ignored. A Corregidoria inspector, with the nervous certainty of someone who had seen too many tentative duty calls end in cover-ups. A young prosecutor from the Ministerio Público, who moved like a locust, efficient, focused, and a camera crew from a local station that had been tipped off by someone who understood the importance of being first in the room. Andrade stayed at her shoulder the whole time, a silent anchor. Alves hovered in the doorway, edges raw, as if the morning had knocked him into a different shape. Valdir and Ricardo were moved to a small holding room, their swagger reduced to something cramped and angry. No one had called the lawyers yet. The first practical moves were being made, statements recorded, evidence tagged, the sealed drive placed into the hand of the Corregidoria inspector and logged with a care that felt almost ritual. Helena watched the formalities, as she had watched the men in the depot, like choreography, where each step either saved or destroyed the possibility of justice. She answered questions with the necessary brevity. She let the inspectors do their jobs. She insisted Alves be interviewed away from the station's common spaces. She watched Guzmão's face while he spoke. There was gratitude there, thin, but also a guardedness that suggested he understood the danger of too much openness. Word spread faster than the formal channels could crawl. Within hours, the battalion yard had a hum that felt like electricity. Phones rang off their hooks. The young prosecutor talked about expedited measures and protective custody without yet releasing names into the world, and Helena felt the legal machine gearing up with that particular clatter of hope and the knowledge that machines also seize. And then the first leak hit. Someone with access, small, careless, or purposely cruel, sent a short, inaccurate note to a tabloid desk. Captain Medeiros detained for drunken altercation with patrol. The headline that arrived before noon would have been laughable if it hadn't been so dangerous. Lies travel fast, corrections crawl. Helena had anticipated this. She moved next, before narrative could harden into rumor. She asked Andrade to transmit a certified copy of the sealed drive to the Corregidoria headquarters, hand-delivered by an inspector who would sign the receipt. She called the prosecutor she had briefed privately the night before, a woman who had more integrity than flair, and asked for a press hold, a legal tool that could slow the tabloids at least. But power has many hands. By mid-afternoon, a different kind of call came, polite, insinuating, an official voice asking for an accommodation. Deputy Bastos's assistant called Guzmão's line, asking to discuss public impact. It arrived like a shadowed hand, indirect, practiced. Guzmão told Helena about it without filter. They want to manage the story, he said. They want to make sure the battalion is not embarrassed. Manage meant bury. Helena heard the same language she had learned in other cases, a tone that assumed reputations were commodities to be bought back from the brink of scandal. She could see the angles already. A quiet, internal reprimand for the officers, a statement about misunderstandings, perhaps a symbolic suspension followed by weeks of genteel neglect. She didn't let it be negotiated. She had chosen the slow brutality of public exposure because she had seen managed scandals become safe for wrongdoers. She asked Guzmão to refuse any off-the-record pressure and to direct political approaches to the Corregidoria. Guzmão's jaw tightened at that. For a moment she saw the man who weighed his career against a higher obligation. He picked the latter reluctantly. That small, reluctant choice mattered. Still, the presence of delegates and deputies in the background meant there would be a fight over narrative. Marcelo Varela, the tabloid journalist, smelled it. He called Andrade twice. He called Guzmão once. He left a message on Helena's phone, insistent, hungry. An exclusive, he said in the voicemail. You can set it straight, or I can set it in a way that people will believe the men who were humiliated. Varela's implication was explicit. He could reframe the story to protect certain interests, or he could feed the machine of rumor. He likened access to currency. Helena set the phone down, feeling the old friction in her ribs, the knowledge that journalism, like law, had its saints and its predators. There was a way to use Varela without letting him use her. There was a way to force what he wanted, an exclusive, into a frame she controlled. If he wanted currency, she could use him as the market to expose the brokers. She made a call to a reporter she trusted, a woman who worked a steady beat at a regional paper and who had never turned an ethical corner for a scoop. The reporter agreed to hold on to the story, to coordinate with the prosecutor and the Corregidoria. That single decision was an anchor, a controlled public channel that would not trade truth for sensationalism. Next came coordination with Alves. He was hesitant. The fear in him was not only for his collar, but for the men he'd worked beside, and for the future he might now be barred from. Helena sat with him in a small interview room and listened more than she spoke. She positioned him as a witness, not a traitor, an approach that mattered in coaxing cooperation. She promised protection in the short term, separate housing, monitored whereabouts, a sliver of anonymity in a world that tracked shirts and faces. Alves agreed to give a recorded statement. He trembled once when he said the words that would matter. The jokes, the shove, the comment about paying in more than cash. But when he spoke, his voice forced the scene into a human register that the grainy tape could not show. The thinness of courage, the weight of complicity. Helena made sure that the statement was recorded by the Corregidoria and backed up, a double custody that left no simple loophole for later denials. She arranged for a lawyer at the Ministerio Público to witness the recording and to place a copy in the prosecutor's secure files. Chain of custody, again, became less a bureaucratic nuisance and more the skeleton that held the body of any future case. Still, the politicians circled. Deputy Bastos emerged more forcefully than she had expected. He phoned Colonel Nunes, not once but twice, asking for calm, suggesting measured steps. At a meeting brought forward that afternoon, Bastos framed his concern as institutional preservation. Headlines would damage the force, he said. Some theatrics were a hazard. He spoke in the flat, persuasive style of a man used to getting his way. Helena listened. She allowed the soldier in the room, the senator of the battalion, to try his old moves. Then, when Bastos left, she sent a short, crisp email to the Ministerio Público and the Corregidoria. A summary of facts, sealed evidence locations, witness contacts, and a request that any political liaison be excluded from procedural influence. She copied the trusted reporter. It was procedural and surgical. Bastos tightened the screws in response. Within 48 hours, a smear campaign began in a low, steady drip. Anonymous social media posts suggesting Helena had a history of difficulties, an article with unattributed sources speculating about her temperament, a whisper campaign about her private life. Someone leaked a doctored photo that showed a younger Helena at a party. The tabloids lapped it up. Varela's column muttered about complexities and unfavorable optics. The goal was clear. If you discredit the victim, the headline becomes a reason to let the accused walk. The first brutal consequence came not in the courtroom, but on the ground. A critical raid scheduled for the week after the depot incident, a narcotics operation Helena had led months earlier, one that threatened a known cartel's logistics, was compromised. The team moved into position at dusk, only to find the safe house emptied and the suspects gone. Radios crackled with confusion. Sources that had been reliable went quiet. The operation failed in a way that sent colleagues home frustrated and vulnerable. Someone had whispered before the right time. Helena's stomach dropped into a familiar place. Sabotage. She had expected political interference, but she had not wanted to pay the price in operations that put civilians at risk. She suspected who had fed the tip. A hand inside the institution pleased to remove her leverage, or a political player with an interest in demonstrating her supposed incompetence. Either way, it was a dangerous escalation. She convened an internal review. Though she knew the hazard, reviews can be weaponized into obstacles. Still, the immediate goal was to protect future ops. She tightened protocols, limited intel access, and asked Andrade to audit the station's recent leaks. Andrade, audibly upset, found fingerprints of an internal list being circulated, paper copies, but with a trail that led to a cluster of names tied to one phone provider. Helena saw it as a test. If the forces trying to silence her could sabotage an operation, they could cause real harm. She escalated accordingly, notified the prosecutor, updated the chain of custody logs, and asked that any officer with a credible link to leaks be temporarily reassigned pending inquiry. The decision angered some. Careers twitch when momentum shifts. But the law board preferred caution to chaos. By then, the Corregidoria had moved public. Slowly, deliberately, an interim statement announced that several officers were suspended pending investigation. It used neutral language. It performed calm. The Sheying crews in the yard filmed the officers escorted out in wind-blown jackets, faces taut, while anchors mouthed the official lines. The footage began to make its way into broader networks. Public pressure grew, a double-edged tool that could force action, but also inflame. Helena's next move required the very thing she had avoided initially, using a corrupt reporter's appetite to create a trap. She arranged a meeting with Varela under controlled conditions, telling him she wanted to give an exclusive in exchange for a recorded sit-down that would set the record straight. It was exactly the bait she needed. Varela, hungry for access, bit. On the morning of the meeting, she did not go alone. Andrade accompanied her, and the prosecutor asked to be near the venue. She met Varela in a neutral cafe under the pretext that it would be off the record, so he could craft a narrative. Varela arrived with a slim smile and the easy arrogance of someone who thinks stories are currencies he trades. He had his phone and a small recorder. What Varela did not expect was that the man sitting 2 tables over would be Deputy Bastos's liaison, and the man who slipped into a booth behind them would be a fixer who had worked with Bastos on reputation matters, people who specialized in turning headlines into weapons. Bastos wanted a memo. He wanted leverage. Varela wanted a byline. The room filled with men who had learned to speak in deals. Helena let them talk first, letting Bastos's man outline a plan in brackish terms, a narrative that would repurpose the depot footage as overreaction, a suggestion of a revenge motive for Helena, an offer to feed an exclusive to Varela for a price. Not necessarily money at first, but favors, access, a steady stream of scoops that would paint a different target. The conversation moved with the comfortable cruelty of men who thought control was simply a matter of narrative. Unbeknownst to them, the prosecutor had placed a legal court-approved recorder in the bag Andrade carried under the table. Andrade had signed warrants that allowed the device to capture what would be offered as evidence. The device was a legal route, documented, admissible, because the prosecutor had anticipated the risk of a plan being formed outside official channels. It was the sort of dark precision Helena had learned to orchestrate, using legal means to catch people arranging illegal or unethical actions. The audio recorded Bastos's voice, steady and low, rehearsing a script that suggested fabricating complaints and spreading them in coordinated outlets to create a spectacle that would balance public perception. He discussed paying Varela through indirect channels for exclusive angles. He said without flinching that a discrediting narrative could be spun, that Helena's integrity was a commodity. When the file was played an hour later for the prosecutor, the room went still. The words were not slander, they were a plan. The recording showed intent, an admission that a campaign would be orchestrated to slander a public official to protect others. That was a crime in the eyes of the prosecutor. Conspiracy to defame, obstruction of justice, attempted misuse of public office. The sting had worked exactly as intended. Helena felt no moral glow at the ambush. It was a necessity, and necessity tends to be cold. She had documented the deceit. She had left a clear trail. The prosecutor wrote subpoenas. The Corregidoria prepared to execute them. The climax came with a press conference that she had not wanted to lead, because fronting a narrative as the victim can be politicized, but which had become unavoidable. The battalion yard was packed with media. Microphones jutted like small metal flowers toward anyone who dared speak. TV vans lined the street. The live feeds were already rolling. Colonel Nunes stood at the podium with the sober face of someone who needed to assert control. The Corregidoria inspector presented the first facts: the depot footage, the suspended officers, the chain of custody confirmation. Then the prosecutor asked for the screen to be turned on. Grainy images filled the backdrop, motion in compressed pixels. Helena watched herself in that loop, smaller than memory, but true. The room watched the three men move around the figure. Across the yard, Valdir shifted in his cuffs. When the second video was cued, audio this time, a dry legal voice saying, "Play the recording." A different sound ran through the crowd, the leaking motor of a projector, and then voices. Bastos's cadence came through, Varela's eager assurances, the finish of a sentence where a fixer suggested a few coercive witnesses. You could see the color leave a politician's face on the screen. You could see the journalist's half-grin collapse into a grimace. The reaction was harsh and immediate. Cameras panned to the people in the video. Bastos's office released a statement that read like damage control, but the audio had shape and specificity that flat statements could not absorb. The prosecutor announced that Bastos would be summoned for questioning, and that Varela and the fixer would be detained briefly for questioning regarding complicity in an attempted smear operation. The Corregidoria announced formal charges for the officers captured in the depot tape: abuse of authority, attempted assault, illicit detention. It was brutal in consequence. The men who had thought their uniforms shielded them found themselves under lights and public judgment. Political allies scrambled. Media commentators who had once whispered about scandal now chastised the idea of institutional arrogance. For those moments, the institution looked like it might tilt toward accountability. Helena stood aside, feeling both vindicated and hollow. The revenge she had engineered was procedural. Its brutality was public and unignorable. It left no physical gore, only records, arrests, and the social death of image. The men who had mocked her at dawn now had their faces played across national feeds and were being moved into formal custody. It felt clean, but it also felt incomplete, because public spectacle brings its own price. Deputy Bastos launched a counter-campaign from the political side, claiming selective leaks and the weaponization of evidence. He hired a high-powered lawyer who issued subpoenas and hints of lawsuits. Varela's tabloid, when pressed, started to run sympathetic pieces about the pressures of police work and the complexities of public life, a siren attempt to muddy the moral clarity of the depot footage. Then came the personal costs Helena had feared. Anonymous threats arrived in slips, texts with no return number, emails with photographs of her car parked alone. Someone punctured a tire at night. Small things, but their message was explicit. Visibility can protect you, yes, but it also makes you a target. Andrade reported that someone had rifled through personnel files and lifted the names of people who had cooperated with Helena. Those names began to surface online in whispers and insinuations. They also tried to make her the story. A social media smear connected her to financial impropriety, false documents manufactured with enough slickness to make certain editors uneasy. Varela, exposed, pivoted to a defensive posture and then to accusations about editorial pressure. For every step forward in the legal corridors, there were 10 steps in rumor mills. But even with the backlash, the legal process moved. The Ministerio Público, backed by the weight of clear videos and recorded conspiracies, presented an arrest petition for Valdir and Ricardo on charges that included abuse of authority and attempted sexual coercion. Alves, in a move that angered some and saved a life in others, provided sworn testimony that matched the depot footage. His admission, public and contrite, was the kind of evidence that reframed the narrative. This was not a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. Major Guzmao's position became one of the story's strangest ironies. At first, he had been an ambiguous figure, part rescuer, part protector of the institution. But investigators found that Guzmao had, months earlier, filed paperwork that reassigned some oversight responsibilities away from the very camera systems that had captured the depot footage. It was a bureaucratic move that, if designed to bury surveillance, would now look like a calculated choice. Guzmao claimed administrative rationales, an overworked office, 1,000 small excuses. The prosecution saw it differently. Inclination to protect was not proof of guilt, but it warranted inquiry. Guzmao was suspended pending further investigation. The public watched the arrests like a drama. Colleagues turned their faces away or stared with new calculation. Some offered thin support. Some offered nothing at all. Helena understood the shifting loyalties. She had been the beneficiary of grudging courage from some officers and the object of thinly veiled contempt from others. Through all this, she kept doing the work. She sat in meetings about operations, adjusted plans to account for leaks, shepherded new protective measures for witnesses, and met with prosecutors to ensure the chain of evidence remained intact. The demands were endless and emotional. The moral cost was a constant ache. Friends who slowly withdrew their calls, invitations politely cancelled, the way colleagues typed with increased formality in internal messages. There were quieter victories too. A community group that had long complained about police behavior reached out to thank her publicly. A junior officer, previously cynical, told her quietly that her actions had shown that institutions can be forced to answer. Those small acknowledgements mattered. They were the personal currency that made the work worthwhile. The legal case took months to unfold in the public eye. Preliminary hearings, subpoenas, motions, and tactical delays slowed the court calendar. Bastos pushed back, filing motions that suggested the evidence had been gathered unlawfully. Varela's lawyers argued journalistic privilege. The Ministerio Público countered with chain of custody documents, signed logs, the sealed drive, and the recorded conversations with documented judicial oversight. Every motion was a chess move. Helena watched the board, not as a victor, but as someone aware that justice is often slow, legal, and messy. Meanwhile, the retaliation grew more sophisticated. An internal memo, leaked anonymously, questioned Helena's leadership on operational decisions from months earlier, citing minor errors and presenting them as a pattern. The messaging had the fingernails of a power fight. Pick away at credibility until the cause slows. A political ally of Bastos floated the idea on the radio that Helena had worked an angle to advance her career. It was a cheap line, repeated with 2 cups of outrage for drama. She endured those blows with an economy of expression. She did not flare. She did not give them fuel. She filed counterclaims when necessary. She made sure that every operation she led thereafter was documented by multiple channels, that each step had witnesses, timestamps, and independent verification. She hardened protocols the way a surgeon sets clamps. Then came an unexpected solidarity that shifted the discourse again. A documentary filmmaker who had been investigating institutional corruption reached out with an offer. Footage. He had been recording patterns of abuse for months. He wanted to include her case in his piece. The documentary's precision, slow, deliberate, evidence-saturated, framed her struggle in the broader context of systemic failure. The combination of legal documents and long-form reporting made rumor less effective. Facts layered upon facts become heavy and difficult to shrug off. The case progressed to a public trial for the officers. Valdir and Ricardo sat in a glass-walled dock, their jokes gone hollow. Alves testified under protection. Andrade gave clear testimony about the tape transfer and signature logs. The prosecutor outlined a sequence that left little space for manufactured doubt. The depot tape, the recorded plotting to smear, the administrative changes that had muzzled cameras, an architecture of wrongdoing that mapped across men and obligations. At the trial, Bastos's defense bent toward character arguments and procedural complaints. The judge listened. The public listened. The court was a slow legal crucible that would, over time, calibrate consequence. In the meantime, the battalion had to limp through the reputational damage. Officers once careless with power had been suspended, some permanently reassigned. The training room filled with new modules on consent, on chain of command, on the boundaries of custody. Not all consequences were immediate. Bastos retained influence. He could move others and pull strings. But the recorded conspiracy had made a new reality visible. If you conspired to spin narratives instead of confronting wrongdoing, you could be exposed and prosecuted. When verdicts finally began to land, they were not all the violent justice that some craving voices had wanted. Valdir and Ricardo faced convictions on several counts. Their careers, once steady as an old chair, collapsed. Guzmão, confronted with evidence of mismanagement and suspicious reassignments, accepted administrative guilt that cost him his position. Bastos faced charges that would stain his political path and require him to defend in court the choices he had made. Varela's professional life unraveled in different ways. Legal trouble, loss of credible sources, and the collapse of a reputation built on exploiting others. Helena watched the outcomes with a moderated relief. The institutional changes that resulted were incremental: new policies, stronger oversight, a public commitment to reform. They were not the end of corruption. The world does not rearrange itself in a single verdict. But the consequences were brutal for the conspirators: stripped uniforms, public admissions, the cold finality of a badge yanked away. And yet the personal toll did not evaporate with their arrests. The years that followed had the shape of people who had been altered. Friends separated into camps. The station's morale was fractured for a long time. The operations that Helena led after the scandal were safer by design, but carried the weight of the fight. Every night there was an undercurrent of watching. There were moments of savage solitude. She received a letter that contained a single sentence: "We can make this worse." It was unsigned. There were nights she woke with her hands clenched, imagining all the small ways someone could still try to undo her. She had to accept that exposure brought vulnerability. She learned to live with that paradox. There were also new alliances. The prosecutor who had worked the case began an internal initiative to better protect whistleblowers and to tighten rules around political interference. Andrade was promoted to a desk that focused on evidence integrity, and he visited sometimes, always with a spare smile that carried the memory of the morning. Alves, who had faced the cost of admitting complicity, gave a public testimony in a training seminar on ethics. He had left the force. He worked now in a community center, speaking with cadets about the quiet dangers of small abuses. He had paid a price and, in some painful way, found a path that tried to make something right of his complicity. Helena herself felt the shape of cost in less public ways. Invitations that were once automatic became rarities. Her phone had fewer friends. She found herself moving through rooms with the clarity of someone who had traded ease for principle. She took refuge in the small rituals, the particular way her tea cooled, the methodical stacking of case files, the exact angle she liked her uniform collar to rest when it was buttoned. The milk bottle remained on her kitchen counter for a long time. It had become a private emblem, ordinary and absurd. Sometimes, on nights when the cost sat heavy against her ribs, she would pick it up and hold it. The plastic had warmed to the room and felt like a relic from a life she had once taken for granted. She was invited to speak at a symposium on police accountability. She accepted, with the same cold pragmatism she had applied to every public move since the depot. She spoke in measured tones about procedure, about chain of custody, about the corrosive effect of unashamed privilege. She did not speak about revenge. When the word came, she let it fall lightly and then corrected the idea. No, her aim had been accountability. But even as she corrected the lexicon, she understood why people used the harsher term. The exposure had felt to some like retribution. To her, it had been a practical use of evidence for civic ends. Yet there were nights when she allowed herself a private, unembellished satisfaction. She would replay mentally a cluster of images, the depot tape flickering on an inspector's monitor, the recording of men plotting, the moment microphones swung toward the podium at the press conference. It was not joy. It was a steady, tempered satisfaction that comes from seeing a plan executed with care. And still, danger lingered. There were men and systems that would prefer to repair without changing. The reforms could be slow and incomplete. Bastos had lost immediate power, but networks are resilient. He could reappear in other corridors, in different guises. The fight was not over. At times, she missed the damnable ease of anonymity, the mornings when she could walk to the market unnoticed. But she had made a decision in that depot. Visibility would be a tool, not a cage. She used cameras, chains of custody, prosecutors and trusted journalists to ensure that wrongdoing had to answer for itself in the light. That kind of fight exacted a price. In the quieter periods, she returned to the small intelligence of living. She bought milk again sometimes. She kept that bottle in the refrigerator, not as a talisman, but as a reminder that small, ordinary acts carry unexpected risk. She kept it also as proof that ordinary life stakes something too, dignity. Months passed. Lawsuits and appeals threaded through the system like stubborn vines. The public conversation shifted from shock to policy debate. Police academies revised curricula. The Corregidoria opened an internal program for rapid camera audits. For a while, cadets were taught the story, what had happened in a depot, how a camera had recorded it, and how evidence had been weaponized both for truth and for protection of wrong. Helena returned to duty in stages. Her badge was not an ornament now. It was a tool that had been tested and tried. She wore it with a different posture. Less of the old certainty that sometimes comes with rank, more of the careful humility that comes from having been both the subject and the instrument of an investigation. People asked her once, in a taped interview after it was safe to speak about the case again, if she regretted the decision to use Varela as bait. She answered simply, "I did what the situation demanded. It was legal, it was recorded, and it exposed the plot." The interviewer pressed on motive, vengeance or justice, and she gave a measured line that became quoted. "They thought a lesson could be taught in a depot. I chose to document it so the lesson could not be taught to anyone else." The quote circulated. It became a kind of shorthand. Some praised her, some said she had engineered a public spectacle. Others used it to argue that institutions needed more transparency. The debate continued. It would, because change is messy and big systems rarely accept correction easily. In time, the extreme heat of the scandal cooled into the steady, ongoing work of reform. Policies were changed, but the social landscape had been altered. Officers who once believed they were invulnerable now spoke more cautiously. Victims of abuse felt at least a glimmer of recourse. That was not nothing. The last scene, the one that stuck in the memory for anyone who had watched her journey, came months later. The battalion yard, on an ordinary weekday, looked ordinary. Boots cleaned, cars parked at attention, the quiet hum of routine. Helena walked the line in uniform, a shape among others. Her hands carried the small plastic milk bottle, clean, washed, an absurd relic. It was an oddly domestic symbol against the hard geometry of duty. A young female sergeant stopped and saluted. She had the hesitance of someone tested by public scandals and newly taught expectations. Helena returned the salute without flourish. The sergeant asked a quiet question about procedure for maintaining custody logs. Nothing dramatic, just the small catalysts that make systems less dangerous. Helena answered. Her voice was steady, not triumphant. Behind them, the station moved as stations always do. Messengers, reports, small corrections. Somewhere, a trainee laughed too loudly. The world went on. She pressed the milk bottle into a pocket, like a private talisman, and turned to walk back into the building. It was a small action, almost silly, but it told a truth. Victory had been achieved in courts and in public, but the cost of visibility remained. The war for institutional integrity was a long one, to be fought in courtrooms, in training rooms, in whispers and examples. She had not ended it. She had forced a tilt. As she entered the corridor, she heard guards and clerks trade names and plans. She heard, too, the faint rustle of new training manuals being printed, the small sound of policy being rewritten. There was movement in the right direction. When she reached her office, she paused at the doorway, looked at the small pile of case files on her desk, and set the milk bottle down carefully atop them. The ordinary sitting on the technical, revelation on the work of law. It felt appropriate. She had been humiliated for 3 hours in a concrete room with a single humming bulb. She had chosen an answer that was not a blade but a lens, evidence, persistence, and exposure. The revenge had been brutal in its public consequences, carefully brutal, legal, and unavoidable. It had not been violent. It had been the kind of punishment that stripped away privilege and left nothing for men who thought uniform equaled immunity. But she also understood the enduring truth. The fight would cycle. Those who profited from silence would look for new avenues. The scorched places in people's lives do not simply heal because a court issues a verdict. They leave memory. She brushed her uniform, smoothed her collar with the same careful hand she used to keep evidence sealed, and walked back into the station, where the work that mattered waited, protecting the public, holding the line, and ensuring that cameras and records served the people, not predators. If this story moved you, subscribe for more accounts of justice, and leave a comment telling where you're watching from.